as we transcend our customary organizations. Today, we start off with a series of papers on time, and we will have 2 more panels tomorrow with a panel entitled Imagined Futures, and on Friday with talks about anthrodecentric stories. If you have questions, you can ask them in the chat box, and we will turn your mics on during the Q&A if you wish to ask your question yourself. So I'm going to now introduce our keynote, Michelle Bastian, Senior Lecturer in Environmental Humanities at Edinburgh College of Art. I'm going to say a few words on Michelle's impressive work. Michelle Bastian works in the areas of critical time studies and environmental humanities, with a particular focus on the relationship between time and belonging. She completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of New South Wales and was a research associate at the Centre for Research on Social Cultural Change, University of Manchester, before taking up her current role in Edinburgh. Since 2013, she has been involved in 8 AHRC-funded research projects, 5 as principal investigator. These projects looked at time and community, local food projects, sustainable economies, temporal design, and transition towns. Her work has been published in a range of journals, including Geo-Humanities, Parallax, Theory, Culture and Society, New Formations, Time and Society, Feminist Theory, and the Journal of Environmental Philosophy. Michelle is an editor of 4 collections, including Field Philosophy and Other Experiments, Unexpected Encounters with the Time, and Participatory Research in More Than Human Worlds. And she's an editor-in-chief for the journal Time and Society. Michelle is the founder and convener of the Temporal Belonging Network, member of the steering committee for the Edinburgh Environmental Humanities Network, founder and convener of the Edinburgh Time Network, member of the Extinction Studies Working Group, and co-founder of the Transition Research Network, which she co-coordinated from 2011 to 2017. So Michelle, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and you can start whenever you want.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I just want to reassure everybody I didn't do all of that at the same time. That was all. It's just a lot of stuff spread out over a lot of time. It always sounds like a lot when you hear it like that. But okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. I put it in. I want to get so I can see the video panel. Okay. All right, so I'll start. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing for a book I'm writing at the moment. I'm on sabbatical, so I've got to finally write this book I've been promising myself I'd do for a while now, which is on thinking about clocks in different kinds of ways. So pulling together different things I've been writing about clocks for the last few years into a synthesized sort of understanding. And I thought it might be interesting to share some of the work I've been doing just for one of the earlier chapters, thinking about how continental philosophy has shaped the way we think about clocks, and how we might want to challenge some of the ways it's done that, and by mostly looking at Bergson and Heidegger. But I'll just be talking about Bergson in this talk today. So just thanks again for everybody who's attending as well. I know we all have a lot of pressures on our time, so thanks for making the time to be here. I really appreciate it. So I thought I should start by acknowledging the subtext in my title, which some of you may have noticed. It is indeed a reference to Derrida's very long note on a footnote in Heidegger's Being and Time from Derrida's book, Margins of Philosophy. So it's hard to resist the nod to this other work, partly given the title of our seminar today. I think, has somebody got their microphone on still? Sorry, thank you. I think that's gone off now. So partly given the title of our seminar today, we're talking about humans as footnotes, but also because I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get to grips with this paper, trying to understand what on earth was going on in it during my PhD. So it has a sort of special place in my heart. So I wanted to allude to it today. So some of you might be relieved to hear, though, that I'm not going to be talking about Derrida's note in any detail today, but what I did want to retain from it is some of the style of approach that comes in this chapter. So in regards to Heidegger, Derrida was interested in what was, quote, both posited and provisionally abandoned. He also says he wants to look at what appears and yet what is elided, as well as what leads us back both to the center and to a margin. And this is what I also see happening in the footnote from duration and simultaneity that we'll look at today. In particular, I'll suggest that Bergson's treatment of clocks takes part in the shifting between appearing and disappearing. And more generally, I'm inspired by Derrida's interest in identifying questions that are structurally closed off within philosophy. Underlying much of this work are efforts to attend to concepts that are arrested or stabilized or stopped in some way, and to ask how they might be allowed to move again. So in my case, I'm interested in how we might come to recognize clock time, so that concept of clock time, as an arrested concept and open it up to moving differently. But why clock time? And particularly, why clock time in what has been called the Anthropocene? For example, across these 3 days, we'll be hearing about the benefits of long-term thinking and deep time thinking. And many humanities scholars have called Western culture out for its illiteracy when it comes to thinking about time in these ways. And often suggestions for thinking about time in more environmentally responsive ways have been made as part of a warning against the dangers of clock time. So my interest in it, in clock time, comes from wanting to understand time, not in terms of flow or of relationships between past, present, and future, but in anthropologist Carol Greenhouse's words, understanding time as a tool for managing diversity. So that is time, the way we conceive it, the way we enact it, actually as a theory of community, as a way of managing who belongs, how they belong, how it's possible for communities to act together. So this is time not as a container, but as a mode of coordination with others, or as Elaine Garn and Anna Singh have put it so nicely, a central aspect of, quote, how things hold. There's a really nice little paper that they've put out recently about coordination and how that holds things together, holds relationships together. So clock time in particular can be seen as something that doesn't simply count or measure, but something that makes it easier for us to attend to some temporal relationships more than others. For example, currently you can look at a clock and tell if you were late for work, but you can't tell if it's too late to mitigate the climate emergency or climate breakdown. Can we change this though? And I've just got a little example here of a phonology clock that might be just a bit of interest. So could we change this? Could we change what relationships clocks tell us about? Could clocks organize us in different ways, coordinate us with different kinds of concerns? So alongside expanding our understanding of our place in longer term cycles and even in geological time, I have argued that we might also want to expand our notions of clock time as well. So after this project on clocks, I'm going to be starting a new project on phonology, which is the study of timing in plants and animals and how they coordinate with each other and the world around them, which offers a sort of different scientific interlocutor than philosophy has often had. You know, philosophy is often taught with physicists or others when it's trying to understand time. And I'm interested in what happens when philosophy talks with ecology to understand that question of what is time. But what I'll talk about in this paper, I mean, I just thought this is a nice example, but the sort of scientific conversation I'll be having in this paper is more with precision timekeeping and time metrology, which will come in later on in the paper. So what I found really frustrating is that when we look to continental philosophy, a key site for thinking through issues of time, there's very little interest in really looking at clocks. In fact, I would argue that this field actively stands in the way of us getting a good look. In particular, we hear a litany of claims about clock time as universal, singular, regular, objective, and above all, dangerous. Since Bergson and Heidegger have been two of these key figures, I'm currently developing close readings of what they do and don't say about clocks. And I just want to share some of my notes of my readings of Bergson that I've gathered so far. So a nice way to start is with this quote included in Heath Massey's really lovely book, The Origins of Time, Heidegger and Bergson, where he's looking at how Bergson might have influenced Heidegger's understanding of time. And here we see Levinas describing Bergson's main contribution to philosophy. So this is Levinas's idea of what Bergson has offered us or given us. And I'll just pick up those parts of that I've italicized. So the destruction of the primacy of clock time. And the credit goes back to Bergson for having liberated philosophy from the prestigious model of scientific time. So clock time is destroyed and we are now liberated from it. Oh joy. Bergson's early work in Time and Free Will, an essay on immediate data of consciousness, provides many examples of this kind of sentiment. When time is turned into space, the line of time that underpins clock time, it becomes an invader, a corrupter. And these are his words. We are unwittingly replaced by a shadowy trespasser, taken over by an almost parasitic outer life, with the clock, and a direct quote from him again, profiting from this influence. So, there's a really sinister understanding of a clock that's taking advantage of us and profiting. So given the impact that ideas like this have had within modernist art and culture, and which continue into the present, is it little wonder then that our instincts are to do away with clock time altogether, rather than turn towards it and wonder how it might be otherwise. But let's move from Time and Free Will to Duration and Simultaneity, published some 33 years later. As many of you may know, this book is Bergson's critique of Einstein's general relativity. But to be clear about our direction, and in keeping with my interest in reading this book somewhat against the grain, I'm not going to talk about Einstein, relativity, or even Bergson's critiques. Instead, what I'm interested in is what we can understand from this text about what a clock is for Bergson, and crucially, what can we understand about what it could be, largely despite Bergson. Sorry for the cheesy clip art with this one, but I thought it showed quite nicely what I wanted to say. So one way you could describe this book is as an interstellar travelogue of people, mainly two men called Peter and Paul, who move across the universe, move across different universes, fixing their attention on clocks. In trying to undermine Einstein's claim that time is multiple, Bergson is particularly interested in uncovering whether the people and clocks that Einstein discusses are real or fantastical. While he criticizes Einstein for creating a theory dependent on mathematical fictions, he himself seeks to discover, quote, in what measure Einstein's times are real times. And he sees himself, again, quote, obliged to post flesh and blood observers, conscious beings at all the points in the system of reference where there are clocks. That's in chapter 2. More simply, in evaluating Einstein's work, Bergson writes, we wish to keep to experience. So let's hold Bergson to this and take from it that a key principle continental philosophy offers us, often despite itself, is that in order to uncover the meaning of clocks, we should be genuinely interested in the experience of observing them. But what is a clock for Bergson? How does he define it? And is there, and it is here that we finally arrive at our footnote. Hopefully you can see that okay. So I've just put the full page in so you can see the context of where it comes from and a little zoom in so you can see the footnote a bit more easily. So note that we are noting a footnote because despite the absolute centrality of clocks to the argument, they are treated as if they are self-evident tools, defined in an offhand way in an aside recorded in small text at the bottom of a page. So that shift between center and margin that I was mentioning in the beginning in Derrida's, from Derrida's paper. So I'm going to pull out a few different things from this footnote in the remainder of my talk, but let's start with that first phrase, because here we have a perfect example of what I believe has gone so wrong in continental approaches to clock time. Clocks themselves are not thought to be worth remarking on. That is, even while remarking on them, even while remarking on them, on being drawn to elaborate on what he means by a clock by adding the footnotes. So something's obviously got to him there that it's like, oh, I better put a footnote in here. Even as he does that, Bergson forecloses the problem the moment that it appears by saying it goes without saying. For someone motivated by the worry that we are so bound to spatialized time and clock time, we can see that from Time and Free Will. So worried about it that we throw away our true selves in our real lives, why is there not more scrutiny, more curiosity? And what is it that goes without saying? Is it the very definition? It is the very definition of what a clock is. Are we so sure that we know the answer to this? So I found two places in Duration and Simultaneity where Bergson supplies us with that definition of what a clock is. There might be more, but these two help us see the second obstacle that continental philosophy puts in our way of seeing. So I've put the two there, and I just put a related one from Heidegger. I've put it in grey because I'm not really going to talk about it, but I thought it might be interesting to be read with Bergson and in light of the kind of criticisms that I'm going to have. So the first definition that we see here directly after the phrase that downplays the issue reads that a clock is any device allowing us to measure an interval of time or to situate two instants in exact relation to one another. So let's look at this in conjunction with the second definition, which is found later in chapter 2, where Bergson is talking about measuring time in a system of reference, where we, quote, disperse an endless number of synchronized clocks and therefore observers across it. This is one of the thought experiments with Peter and Paul. So in the midst of this kind of thought experiment, he writes that by clock, we simply mean here an ideal reading of time according to definite laws or rules. So both of these definitions might seem self-evident to you as well, but I want to invite you to look at them again. Look at how Bergson emphasizes the ability to read exact relations and to ideally record the time. If you had read the book, think of all the times that he mentions Peter and Paul reading the correct time of synchronized clocks. And then think about your own real life experiences of looking at a clock. Is this really what they do? Think about all the times that you've had to adjust, correct, cajole, recalculate, compare, or even ignore what a clock said. If you're really interested in the experience of observing clocks, should all these experiences be ignored? By ignoring them, are we also maintaining mathematical fictions, fantasies of what a clock is? Maybe I'll go back here. I'll get back to that in a second. So I'm pressing on this issue because, in fact, none of us have ever seen a clock that we could read the correct time from. There is no single clock that does this. Dip your toe into any conversation about precision timekeeping, and this will become immediately apparent. I won't go into all the details of the graph, but I just want to put this image, but I just wanted to put it up to show some of the complications that are involved in telling clock time today. So coordinated universal time, UTC, for example, which is the time scale underpinning current clock time, is what is called a post-processed time scale. This means that while UTC is implemented in various laboratories, so you can see the UTC-K there is an example of an implementation of UTC in a particular laboratory. You can only know what the correct time was after the International Bureau of Weights and Measures publishes its list of corrections to these particular implementations. So that's the circular T that you can see on the image there. As Dimitrios Matsakis, Chief Scientist for Time Services at the US Naval Observatory, points out, UTC itself exists only on paper. So there is no clock that tells UTC, basically. So we can obviously talk more about this in the discussion afterwards, but I think this discrepancy really matters, because by stating over and over again that a clock is something that tells us exact, regular, repeatable time, we saw that in the Heidegger quote, we keep looking past all the work that goes into making clocks, deciding what kinds of time that will be told, how this will be calculated, who is affected and who isn't, and what we can coordinate with using these devices and what we can't. So all the decisions, all the negotiations, all the compromises are missing. When we see instead that a clock is a fudge, that its ontological being is to be tinkered with, we can more easily see it as a product of decisions, of power struggles, of selective attention and uneven global infrastructures. But let's not leave it there, because in that classic Derridean move, we can actually see this possibility of the interested over the disinterested clock in other places in Bergson's text. I forgot to move on to this. This is just another example of the complications of telling precision time, and this comes from Google's True Time protocol, which I won't go into detail about. I'll talk about this a bit in one of the later chapters in the book, but obviously, you know, just the messiness of this shows how complicated it is to try and tell precise time, and also how it's never really achieved. But so let's go back to Bergson to think about this disinterested or interested time. So take, for instance, his discussion in chapter 4, where he unpacks the experience of comparing clocks to determine simultaneity. Because, I mean, this happens all the way through the book, although Peter and Paul keep looking at these clocks to see if they're simultaneous or not, to try and test Einstein's relativity theory. So here he writes that if simultaneity were only correspondence between clock readings, if it were not also and before all else correspondence between a clock reading and an event, we would not build clocks, or no one would buy them. For we buy them only to find out what time is. But to find out what time is to note the simultaneity of an event, of a moment of our life, or of the outside world with a clock reading. It is not in general to record a simultaneity between clock readings. So here, bubbling just below the surface, is an important and essential insight. We look at clocks not to calculate the exact time, but because they are useful to us, because they connect to our lives, to events we want to keep track of, to worlds that we want to be part of. Deeper still, even if we pushed below that interest that we see bubbling up through here, we'll see that Bergson here is talking about generic clocks, generic people, generic events. But if we dug below that, underneath that rushes out further questions about which events, which worlds, which people, which use. Bergson links clock time to social life very clearly in Time and Free Will, for example, but primarily in terms of our fall from our authentic inner worlds. And what I'm pushing for here is that this essential link to social life is not seen as a byproduct, but would be sort of a contortion that clocks force us into, but would be better incorporated into our very definition of what a clock is. So we've not actually got very far in our footnote, and at this rate, we're not going to get to the end of it, but I do think we have time left to at least get to the end of that first paragraph. And so let's do that, because I'm hoping it will help us make a stronger link between our tinkerable clock, our clock that is always tinkered with, and the notion of Anthrodecentrism that's brought us all together here today.
It's actually like in that sense, you know, halfway between brute beasts and gods.
Thanks. So if the first part of the paragraph treats the clock as obvious. I've just lost my place. Okay, and may seem obvious to us on first reading, these last three sentences in that first paragraph could come across as quite radical. Here, Bergson points towards something he states more explicitly elsewhere, namely that any motion could become representative of time and be given the status of a clock. In this passage, a clock can be light traveling, a wheel, a mirror, or a planet. So these certainly don't accord with what we usually think of when we think of a clock. So I'm really interested in that it opens up all these possibilities of what we could use clock time for, how we could make it, if any motion could be a clock. And he says that quite a few times. And the physicists he's in dialogue say that as well. But once again, as this footnote opens out a question, it also shuts it down. Because just as Bergson says that any motion could be a clock, he also says that it doesn't matter which one we choose. And he does that a few times. It could be anything, but it doesn't matter what it is. Because of his interest in proving that real time is single and universal, in part to combat Einstein's multiplicity of times, he again doesn't really look at the clock and how it works. This is even while pointing out that Einstein has an interest in selecting light as a clock because it supports his theory. So you find that in lots of places that people are saying, well, Einstein, you've just redefined what a clock is by using the propagation of light because it makes your theory work for you. So that, there's an interest in him choosing that movement, that motion. And there's also a really interesting passage where Bergson talks about more generally that the history of physics can be read as a history of the changes in clock designs. So he talks about different kinds of clock designs and what they allow us to do. But instead, because he defines clocks in terms of exactitude, Einstein's clock, based on the propagation of light and particularly its accuracy, is described by Bergson as the ultimate clock, the one that is the term of all these successive approximations. So it has a very progressivist history of clocks that they're all aiming to become more and more accurate, and they replace each other as we go along, as we find the more accurate one, we replace all the ones before with this more accurate one. So what is not recognized, however, is that different motions actually do lead to different times that are used for different purposes. So return to UTC, the coordinated part, the reason it's called UT, Coordinated Universal Time, is the fact that our clock time is actually an effort to bring together atomic time and solar time, or the rotation of the Earth. And these times don't match up perfectly. The motions that we track in the atom and that we track with the Earth don't match up perfectly, leading to the need for leap seconds, which I won't go into detail, but there's a tinkering that goes on to try and get these times to match up because of the usefulness of doing so. More generally, when we return to the world of precision timekeeping, we'll learn that there are many timescales available for many different purposes. Let me just see what image I've got. So in 2016, I had a really strange experience of attending an astrophysics conference at Harvard. And the conference was focused on the futures of precision timekeeping, but included papers from a range of areas, including one from Danny Hillis on the construction of the clock of the long now, a clock that is planned to run for 10,000 years into the future, and which we'll be hearing more about later today, which I'm looking forward to. And this is just, I just wanted to put up, this is a bit of the paper that Hillis presented. So as he was discussing this paper, he discussed the different kinds of times that the clock would be using. And you can see on the right-hand side where he talks about the 5 kinds of time generated. And you can see there's lots of discussion about that. So he talks about derived solar time, monotonic corrected time, planet display time. And he commented that the complexity of time scales, including the ability to choose which one works best for you, was poorly understood by the general public. And what was really fascinating when this happened was there was a knowing ripple of laughter that came across all of these time metrologists and astrophysicists, generally agreeing that, yes, the public had a very narrow understanding of how time is kept. And I found this particularly interesting And fascinating, since as I've argued here, continental philosophy has taught us that clock time is a kind of unassailable monolith. So I'm just to conclude here, I'm just going to talk about this quote too. But what if Bergson's effort to liberate us from scientific time, as Levinas claims, hasn't really freed us at all, but instead kept us stuck in an unquestioned and unquestionable dogmatism? And I'm partly saying that because when you look at more contemporary discussions in continental philosophy about what clocks are, they repeat this idea of clock time as objective time, universal time, regular, repeatable. And it just kind of keeps flowing through, keeps getting said again and again. So again, compare our idea of this unrelenting tick of the clock to this comment by astrodynamics engineer John Seago and his colleagues when they write, the current UTC standard serves as well as a politically acceptable omnibus timescale for civil timekeeping. And think about politically acceptable civil timekeeping, omnibus timescale. You know, omnibus is in, it gathers together different types of time together. But it's too much to expect to have one timescale for all purposes. Different applications have different requirements, and there is a need for multiple timescales. So we need different clocks telling us, working on different scales for different purposes. And this is widely accepted in this area. Because it's impossible to always use one scale. One should let the application determine which time scale is to be used and then choose the time scale that is appropriate. Society already lives with many available time scales. Every time zone is a different time scale based on UTC. So because of the lack of public understanding of multiple timescales, the paper concludes that the claim that the issue of civil timekeeping is ultimately an educational one. So there's a big interest in educating the wider public, but technicians and engineers as well, about this variety of time, ways of using time, because this assumption of clock time is singular has got such a strong hold. So usually this education is directed towards specialist users, but what I've suggested in this paper and in different ways in different papers, which I'll now conclude, I've been interested in increasing our curiosity around questions of who might get in on this opportunity to choose their own most appropriate timescales underpinning our clocks, and what these timescales might look like. While we might agree with Bergson's effort to center human consciousness at the root of real time, what other opportunities for rethinking the time that arranges our worlds and us within it have been continually overlooked because of his interest in freeing us from this scientific clock time, by bringing us back to that individual consciousness of the now that we use to read the clock, if you know that kind of work. How have these ideas of the clock blocked one particularly important avenue for addressing climate breakdown, biodiversity loss, and environmental injustice? To do this work of rethinking and then redesigning and remaking time in the Anthropocene, I don't think we need only the mysteriousness of relativity or the unfathomableness of deep time, although we do need those as well. I think we can also do this work by really looking at the clock and letting it finally actually catch our attentions. That's it. Thanks, everybody. Here's some nice other clocks as well that I like to show people.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for a captivating talk. What do you think? Do you want to do the Q&A now, or would you rather do it after the two other papers? Because we wrote that there was going to be a Q&A now in the program, but we can do however you prefer. We can have a couple of questions now and then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have a bit of a discussion now. Okay. If people would like to, then see how it goes.
That would be great. And then, yes. And then you can mull over other questions while the two other speakers present. Okay, so you can either ask your questions in the chat box or ask to speak up as you want.
I mean, particularly because this is my, I mean, I've been reading a fair bit of Bergson, but this is my first time to really write about him. So I don't know if there's any Bergsonians here, but it'd be interesting to hear about how it came across, if I'm missing anything or misreading anything.
Are there philosophers in the room? I know there are.
Well, and also just that question of clock time and philosophy. I just think it's quite different between analytic and continental, but any comments on that too, we really appreciate it.
Actually, can I ask something? It's
Yeah.
not philosophy related, I'm afraid.
No worries.
Not much more down to earth than this, but I was really interested in what you said about the fact that we need different clocks for different things. And I was wondering if you had looked at what artists are doing to try and measure the different kinds of time you mentioned, as in, for instance, climate, etc., etc. I know there's some really interesting artists that are actually associated to the Long Now Foundation that are working on clock time. I know Jonathan Keats, for instance, work with like very ancient trees and is measuring, the rings, and the distance between rings to give us a sort of to make us understand how the time of the Earth works. And so, if you look at the distance between the rings, then you can measure whether or not we are polluting very fast, we've got more CO2, etc., etc. I was wondering if you've been looking at what artists are doing to make us apprehend these different timescales that you've mentioned, or whether you're purely looking at the clocks we know, or what you've read about this.
Well, I actually have a Tumblr where I collect I haven't got everything in there because I haven't got it all up to date, but this is like some of you here, I know I've seen this already. Example of artists and different kinds of clothes, but there's lots more examples that I could put in that really. But I do think there's lots of really interesting stuff going on in a similar way to the way that maps, for example, in critical cartography, were really inspired by what artists were doing with maps too, how they were challenging what a map is, what it could be. There's, a lot of work too around rethinking the clock. But one of the chapters in the book was also going to be about the sort of the trouble that we run into when we try to redesign these clocks, and how artists and political activists and others who have tried to offer us different clocks, because they haven't thought through some of these dogmatisms around what a clock is, haven't really challenged time as much as they thought they had. So there's also this chapter about how we do need to look more closely, because some efforts that we've undergone to try and rethink time haven't grappled with it in as interesting ways as I think they could. And the clock of the long now is one of the examples that I have there, actually, that I think it's quite, well, we can talk about that later, but that's one that I think has got a lot of promise, but could think about clocks in more radical ways to perform the kind of job that it's seeking to do. But yeah, I mean, there's lots. They're really fascinating. I'd love to make a coffee table book of collecting them all together and having little blurbs on them. And I think that would be really helpful and really needed, because one of the things Kevin Berth talks about, this anthropologist who does lots of really interesting stuff around clocks and time, talks about how restricted our repertoire is for thinking about how to keep time and tell time. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Thank you.
Because obviously I was thinking about this work, I think it's entitled The Clock by Christian Markley. And I don't know if you know this work, which is a 24-hour loop video with, of course, yeah, you know it. It's true that it doesn't question the very notion of time, as good as it is. It's a fascinating artwork, but yeah, it's time as we've, as we know it, basically.
Well, it colludes. I mean, from what I understand of it, I've been lucky enough to be able to go to it, but from what I understand of it, it colludes with this idea that a clock tells this regular, repeatable time, in that, you know, it very cleverly picks out all these times and puts them all together in this 24-hour. But, you know, what about I don't know if I don't think it shows when the clocks are broken, when they're telling the wrong time, when someone has to fix them, when someone changes them, you know, that would be really interesting to do with films. You know, there's so much, I mean, time travel stuff, but also the rest of it. Why, you know, it tells the story in the way that we're this mathematical fantasy of the clock that keeps this regular time across 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And I think this is why it's really important that, you know, the emphasis that you see in Husserl and Heidegger and Bergson of when they talk about clocks, it's often that person looking at the clock. That's the sort of hinge point that they're really interested in. But they're not really interested in the person. Where is this person? What kind of person it is? What time is it when they're looking at it? Are they looking at it as, you know, daylight saving is about to be implemented? You know, that clock looks very different from at another time. You know, what's their context? Why are they looking at the clock just then? What do they want to know? You know, all that stuff I think is really important and gets left out in all these contexts, creating this fantasy clock that we just keep repeating. Louisa.
Yeah, Louisa, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it? You can, as you want. Okay. Maybe, or do you want, maybe I can, read her question.
Louisa.
Yeah,
no worries, Louisa. How to apply Bergson to the slowing acceleration of time in literature. I actually don't know that installation or the book, actually. So I think it would be nice. I guess I'm. I mean, the stuff I've been talking about isn't so much his idea of duration. Is it? You know, it's not. You know, I think all that stuff he talks about our experience of time is, you know, really fascinating, important, as everybody does. But it's more that in talking about that, he keeps ushering us to turn away from what kinds of things a clock could do. So it would be interesting more to think about clocks slowing. I don't know, this slowing and acceleration that happens within clocks, or could happen within clocks, to basically to sort of open them up for reimagination. If we define them more broadly, rather as just these things that tell us the exact time, that there's these devices for coordinating us with things that are significant to us. We could think about a clock that worked across different rhythms, and even irregular rhythms, or rhythms that worked in quite different ways, and that we might want to do that because it helped us in these other temporal tasks that are being ignored because we're using the regular clock as the kind of device to solve all our temporal problems quite often.
Alix, you had a question. Do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I think I can do that. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this truly fascinating presentation. Yeah, so I'm listening to you. I remembered, sorry about the noise, there's my cat down there. I remember visiting the Science Museum in London a few years ago, and there was this wonderful installation about clocks. And I remember seeing there sort of very old, antique Japanese clocks, which were vertical ones, actually. And there was an explanation saying that before Japan was more open to the world and Western civilization, they had developed a very different way of representing time. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that and what you would make of a vertical clock.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, because I think it is the Edo period clocks. Because I've had a conversation with Kevin Berth's working on this and writing about this, but I don't know if he's published anything on it yet. And if I remember him correctly, they're examples of mechanical clocks that can shift. They shift the lengths of the hours. Is that correct? I can't remember exactly, but they're they're a nice example of a mechanical clock that doesn't tell the same kind of regular time that we expect a mechanical clock to, so that you can use this mechanical system to tell time that is uneven or regular in a different kind of way from just this now, you know, that we're kind of used to punctuated time in a different kind of way. But I can't remember all the details because we had a great conversation, but it was about 5 years ago, sorry. But yeah, I mean, they're a nice example of how, if you start looking more closely then too, I mean, even if you look at things like water clocks or candle clocks, you know, there's lots of kinds of examples that, or Kevin Burth has a great paper about roosters, how roosters have been really important in time reckoning. And there's another wonderful paper by Kate Wersan about melons, when melons sprout, and those being sort of organic timekeepers that have been really important in gardening. And, you know, she's talking about in the States. It's a brilliant paper. You can start seeing these things. You start seeing all the different kinds of objects and different ways of telling time that are available that we use, but we might not associate really with keeping time. Yeah, no, they're really interesting. Was there?
Kristen, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Michelle. I'm like trying to think in my mind how I can best ask this question. But I work with chronobiologists, and I'm sort of trying to, I think perhaps we have sort of a similar interest in terms of thinking about time in science, and also time as something that's embodied and lived in sort of biological systems. But I always find myself feeling really frustrated by this phrase body clock, which is used as a metaphor for explaining the sort of micro ways that our cells adapt to our time environments. And the scientists use it a lot, and they find it a very good kind of public metaphor for explaining it. But is a body clock like a clock? And I hate using that phrase body clock because I think it does a disservice to how the body keeps time. But perhaps now after your talk, I'm feeling I'm too limited in what I think a clock is. And I guess I just wanted your perspective about the body clock and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to bring up Kevin Burth again, but he also has a paper about body clocks and time and psychology, and we sort of differ on this. So he is non-clock timekeeping and thinks we should keep this idea of clock for these very regular devices because they are have a stronghold that you can't. He doesn't think maybe we could really undo this definition, that we should be talking about non-clock timekeeping and show the variety of it. And so he's got a really nice paper that talks about the problems. I mean, his book Time Blind sort of talks about this, about the trouble, this standard understanding of what a clock is, how that gets translated to different fields, and how that makes us sort of unable to see what's going on with time in that situation. And so I can send you the link to the paper, but he does talk about how the clock hides what's going on in circadian rhythms and body clocks. And I mean, I'm really interested in that idea because of this idea of Zeitgebers, that the you know, what we see really in circadian rhythms is the way relationships give us time. And what we see in those so-called body clocks are clocks that adapt and react and respond and shift, and in order to accommodate relationships or respond to what's going on in the environment. And they're very different from precision timekeeping, because precision timekeeping is all about keeping the clock unresponsive. So all of these progressive, you know, that Bergson's talking about, these progressive shifts in the timekeeping are often about keeping the clock away from being affected by anything. So it's not affected by, you know, humidity or temperature or, you know, even gravitational waves or quantum, you know, gravity and all this kind of stuff going on. The clocks that are at the heart of all this precision timekeeping, which sort of ultimately, you know, is the UTC that we see, and I think is about creating a device that doesn't respond. And is that really what we want in a climate breakdown and mass extinction and, you know, social injustice, you know, in so many different kinds of ways? And so when we look at circadian clocks, that's really nice. And this is why I'm interested in phonology as well, is how do we think about timekeeping as relationship oriented, as responsive, as not worrying about regularity so much as allowing things to hold together, you know, in that kind of phrase of supporting relationality and adapting in order to help make that work as things change within us and around us. So I can send you that paper though, or I'll try and put it in the chat a bit later.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? We have 5 more minutes if you want. Otherwise, you can ask your questions afterwards. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Okay. I was preparing myself for a bunch of people saying, no, you've reading Bergson wrong. So if anybody is feeling that way, do say it would be nice to hear it.
So I might have a question, but I'm afraid it's going to sound very messy. So I'm going to try and.
That's the best kind of question, don't worry.
Sorry. I was wondering, is there any way, I'm not saying that this is what Bergson is doing, but if we, you know, take that sort of image of the clock as that sort of awful device that's kind of forcing this automatic way of thinking and being upon us, is there any way that tradition of understanding it that way might be related to forms of ways of trying to understand how in some cases that measured time is indeed imposed upon people, for instance, in the context of work. I'm thinking of the idea of, you know, clocking in and clocking out and those kinds of those contexts in which such as work, in which we do not own our own time, and somehow, you know, I'm thinking if I work really efficiently, I'm lucky enough that I can just clock out and no one's going to ask me about it. If I were working, you know, on an assembly line, my hours would be counted, and if I do things more efficiently, then I wouldn't be able to just leave, and so I wouldn't be allowed to choose that time scale as you were suggesting, because my time sort of belongs to someone else. And so I was wondering whether maybe, because you were talking about social injustice and the kind of the ability to choose or not, or the inability to choose, whether that idea of measuring time and might have to do less about the clock per se than about ways in which people might use it to sort of you know, sit someone else down and make them work for them. Sorry, if that makes sense.
No, I mean it does, because I think you said it there at the end that someone did choose that time, but it wasn't the person who it's been imposed on in that kind of way, you know, that and when you when clock time is reified as that's just what time is this thing, then all those power dynamics can get hidden. So I mean, an example that really resonates for me is the way it's used in unemployment offices, for example, with the, you know, in so many places, you know, you see examples of the appointment starts at 9 o'clock, and if you're not there, you're going to get your support payments are going to get reduced or taken away in some way. And part of that is reliant on, this is just what the clock time is, and you're expected to follow it. And if you don't, that's your problem. It's not a problem with the system or a problem with the person who decided that we should read the clock in that kind of way. And even if you go back to sort of the clocking in, clocking out, you know, there was lots of distrust of the clock because the managers would slow the clock down, or they'd shift the time on it. And I think by not paying attention to that in philosophy, that you can change the time on the clock. You know, that people do that even just the fact that people put on a couple of extra minutes on their personal alarm clocks to help them get up in time, you know, that kind of thing is happening all the time. And I think that, you know, that is sort of ontologically relevant, you know, that's relevant for what we think a clock is, what the being of the clock is this, you know, being able to be tinkered and that there's an interest in encouraging a belief that you can't tinker with it. That helps some people over others. That gives people more power over others, that it can't be changed, that, well, we can't discuss that because the clock just says, it's 5 p.m. and that's just it, that's the rule. How can, I've talked about this other places, Google, Facebook, what's the other one? Amazon, they all create their own time scales. They've created, I've sort of talked about in other places and other examples, but they've created their own time scales to deal with time problems. They make up a new time scale, and they implement it because they're big enough to do that. Why are they the only ones allowed to? Why are they the ones allowed to do this? What would it mean to democratize that ability and capacity? Or just even see it as contestable, just even see it as a possibility rather than this reification of clock time that sees that there's nothing we can do about it. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, these power dynamics make me think of David Foster Wallace's novel Infinite Jest, where the Gregorian calendar is replaced by, by years that are subsidized by specific corporate sponsors. And so a year is not a year anymore. It's, 2025 is not 2025 anymore. It's the deep-end adult undergarment year.
Well, at that astrophysics conference, someone was also talking about in Rome, I don't know the history of this, but you could bribe whoever it was decided when the year was finished, you could bribe them to shift that date, there's lots of stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes.
So that has happened.
Yeah.
As well.
And people who do attention studies, I believe, work on that. Also the fact that because our time is so valuable, our attention is so valuable that it's a currency, So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have more questions, or should we move on to our next speaker? Perhaps, and you can ask more questions at the end if you want. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So we have the pleasure of welcoming John MacDonald, who obtained his BA and MA in philosophy from Brock University and a BS in education from Medaille College. Don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, Medaille College. His thesis was on Heidegger and the Greeks, which was published by Brock University. And his main areas of interest are Heidegger, Nietzsche, and the Greeks. Most recently, he published an article that passed peer review called The Justified Lie by the Johannine Jesus and its Greco-Roman Jewish Context. So John, whenever you want, and I think you don't have a PowerPoint, so you can start whenever you want.
Okay, thank you.
It's not that your computer is broken if you don't see the image.
Yeah, wasn't sure how to do a PowerPoint with Zoom, so I'll try it the old-fashioned way. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Healing Through Nietzsche's Twofold Eternal Return, and it looks at the philosophy of time from Aristotle to Heidegger and beyond. So as a general framework, I'm going to be talking a little about Carlo Rovelli's ideas regarding time as not being an objective thing that we are sort of encountering in nature, and also Heidegger's reading of Aristotle and Kant to put forth a general framework. And then the second part of my paper is going to be Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche and his idea of eternal return. So let's see if we can get through it. So we certainly experience something with time, such as a subtle drawing out, stretching out, and flow, and in fact really experience this in certain cases, like a child's fidgety time out punishment facing the corner, or cabin fever at a rainy cottage. The German word for boredom conveys this, Langeweile, the stretching out of time. Likewise, we can severely alter the nature of our experience of time, such as through psychedelic drugs. So what is time? Now I'm going to talk about Ravelli. Ravelli suggests that perhaps one of the key discoveries in modern physics is that there is no one time thing that uniformly flows. For instance, we can measure that time speeds up the higher you go on Earth and slows down the lower you are. It reflects gravity. This had to be taken into account when they were developing GPS satellite technology. Analogously, the flow of time passes at a significantly lower rate close to the gravity pulled near a black hole as opposed to far away from it. Ravelli points out that all of the important equations describing reality in physics before the 1960s described how things change in time, such as velocity, acceleration, etc. But more recently, some equations of quantum gravity, such as the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, can be written without any reference to time at all. Ravelli explains that when traditional physics begins by describing the motion of a swinging pendulum while comparing it to a clock, it's a misunderstanding to think the pendulum is really being held up to objective time, but rather the movement of the pendulum is held up to the movement of the hands on the clock. Similarly, saying I woke up at 8 a.m. in the morning actually means I woke up when the sun was at such and such a position. And at the level of the very small, our understanding of time doesn't work well to describe reality. Ravelli says time isn't a thing, but rather a useful model for organizing our daily experiences, analogous to the spatial categories of high and low. And just as the categories of high and low become meaningless in outer space, so too is time meaningless at the micro level. Modern physics is beginning to really see the implications of Einstein's insight that the past and future are illusions, which makes good sense in light of Husserl's point that we can never leave the living present. The past is just a past present and the future a future present, so they may only have being in memory and anticipation. Ravelli argues that the hypothesis that time is a mind-independent thing will one day be abandoned, as so many other concepts and hypotheses have, as our philosophical and scientific knowledge has grown and progressed. So taking that basic idea that with time we're looking specifically at the perceiver and the interpreter, I'd like to talk a little bit about what Heidegger had to say regarding Aristotle's philosophy of time. So, Aristotle said time is with things, although not the same as them. Time is everywhere, not in one definite place, and not in the moving and changing thing, but beside it, in some way close to it. Aristotle said motion and time differ in how they belong to the moving thing. Aristotle said time is also in the soul and is inherently countable. Heidegger explains the odd-sounding point that for Aristotle, without the counter to count or attend to time, there is no time. What does this mean? For instance, without the person to experience the stretching out of time and boredom with the boring TV show, then there is no boredom or stretching out of time. And similarly, in enjoyment or absorption, when time vanishes or flies by, a perceiving is required. And this is one point I found really interesting from Heidegger's analysis. Heidegger says that analogously, from one point of view, I experience time as a now or present flowing forward. So Monday, then Tuesday, etc. But conversely, from another point of view, we experience it flowing in the opposite direction as backward flowing out of the future toward us, such as Christmas is coming, has arrived, has gone. The key to understanding Aristotle, Heidegger, and Heidegger on time is that what you are aware of with time is not simply other. So for instance, while there may be a distinction between one, the perceiver of the TV, and two, the perceived TV, there is also certain important aspects that fall outside of this distinction. For example, experiencing the TV as boring. The stretching out of time as the boringness or Langeweile of the TV show is in one sense a characteristic of the show, in that we really experience and feel contact with the show as being boring. But we qualify this because we understand that the next person may not experience it as boring at all. Beside the person and other, there's a third element that is the unity of the two in being bored with the TV show. This stretching out aspect of time is not simply person or other, but the way in which I transcend myself in another. So, and this would have been obvious for Aristotle because it was part of how the Greeks understood the world. The ancient Greek poet Homer illustrates and emphasizes this context when Homer says that the gods don't appear to everyone in their fullness, energeis, in reference to Odysseus experiencing a woman as though she was an avatar for the presencing of divine beauty itself, even though the other person beside Odysseus didn't experience the woman in this way. Also, and we can use other examples to clarify, experiencing someone or thing as sexy is similar. And so a gay man isn't aroused by a gorgeous female movie star, or someone finding a bridge or tower arousing if they have a particular kind of objectophilia. I certainly experience sexiness to be a quality of the movie star, even though it really isn't, since there's no reason to suppose the next person will have a similar experience. So this helps us to understand Aristotle Heidegger's point that time is everywhere, but also in the soul. And without the counter to count, there is no soul. We do feel real contact with time, such as in the felt stretching out of time in boredom, or the exciting anticipatory flow of time backwards as Christmas approaches, or the monotonous flow as the work week inches forward. The usual interpretation of time that people have is to mistake this felt contact with something other to be contact with a mind-independent objective reality. And so our modern understanding of time naturally reifies or thingifies time into a thing, like a chair or a mountain. And Heidegger also points out that the philosopher Immanuel Kant had an interesting point to say about this. So just immediately before Kant, David Hume pointed out that we don't sense cause and effect. We just sense in lived experience, the following of one thing upon the other, either thing upon thing, like when a ball hits another ball and it causes it to go forward, or one state upon another. So for example, the raw egg turning into the cooking egg when cooked. We just sense A, then B, then C, whereby we associate necessity because we sense them so often. So Hume said that we don't experience cause and effect. It's just that we experience water boiling so many times when we heat it to 100 degrees that the mind just performs a little trick and associates the one with the other. And so we experience it as an objective reality. So Kant agreed that we don't sense cause and effect. We do, but he said Hume was wrong because we understandingly experience cause and effect, because in boiling water or frying an egg, we experience these causal processes according to a rule of time, according to a rule of temporal irreversibility. So, so when we're experiencing water boiling or an egg frying, we don't sense that there's something objective going on there. But what we do experience is that the one follows upon the other according to a rule of time being irreversible. And Kant says we see this to a lesser degree in boiling water, because when we boil the water, if we take the heat away, then the water stops boiling. And but we experience this fully when we cook an egg, because when the egg goes from being raw to being cooked, you can't reverse time and uncook the egg again. So this business of temporal irreversibility, it's not something that we encounter. We just see A, then B, then C, then D. But we do not, the mind nonetheless furnishes our experience of time with this notion of irreversibility. We don't see irreversibility, but we still experience it understandingly. So the question then, what makes the layperson modern interpretation of time as an objective thing of nature possible to conceive? If time is a way that the person self-affects themselves, one way this happens is spatially. So I'll clarify what I said earlier. So one, we experience the flow of time as a living present that marches on into the future, Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday, etc. But time experiences flowing in this way is not simply an objective feature of reality, as most modern people assume, but represents a way that humans organize, schematize their experiences, which is why, too, we can just as easily experience time from a contrary point of view, flowing in the opposite direction from out of the future, arriving in the present and passing away into the past, such as Christmas is coming, has arrived, has gone. In these two contrary cases, which would be incompossible if time was a singular thing that flowed uniformly, the two experienced flows of times are being organized spatially by our minds. For one, in the first case above, we are implicitly assuming an organizing principle, the likes of which I would find if I was on a soccer field kicking a ball away from myself, which would be consciously or unconsciously fixing the origination point of my kicking of the ball in memory, and then mentally stretching from there along with the ball as it rolls away from me. While in the second case, we are framing the flow like being a goaltender, with the ball being kicked at me from a distance by a friend, the ball arriving at me and passing away through my legs into the net. Time schematized or organized spatially basically means consciously or unconsciously fixing a point and stretching from that point, spatially schematized in terms of temporality as the rate of that stretch. Number one above is what is generally reified or thingified into being real or objective time by the modern person, while in truth it is just a practical way to calendarize our lives. So in other words, we usually think that time basically means Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday, then the next month, then the next year, then the next decade, and that's what real time is, just marching on into the future. And that is one way we experience it. But we also experience it flowing in the opposite direction from, if we look at it in a different way, like Christmas is coming out of the future, oh, it's arrived, and now it's passed off behind us. Okay, so Nietzsche, or Heidegger's Nietzsche. In his book, The Gay Science, Nietzsche talks about what would happen if time was actually repetitive, if the moment we are experiencing now is actually going to repeat again and again, forever, eternally. What does this mean? So Nietzsche says, if that was the case, would you consider it to be something that would cause you to be gnashing your teeth and terrible, or would it be something that would be a joyous blessing? So let's consider this. Nietzsche considers this in terms of the temporal infinite, which he argues is twofold. Now, ad nauseum, ad infinitum express the stretching out of time and boringness or longueville of something that has repeated or that has continued to the point of nausea. We see this in an argument from repetition, for instance. Nietzsche says we usually encounter beings in a tragic way, in terms of infinite eternal recurrence, a circular repetition of time, where, for instance, a once numinously experienced favorite gospel song goes from being experienced as holy to being experienced as annoying simply by playing it 20 times in a row. The luster of beings for us fades simply as a function of our spending time with them. In other words, for instance, the numinous or holy are not what's, properties of beings we encounter like hardness, but reflect the how or the way the mind or body auto-affects itself. Nietzsche called this God is dead. Whatever the luster of being has for us is destined to fade. And tragically, we simply live our lives wandering from one distraction to the next. Nietzsche references Ecclesiastes in the Bible for this idea, making the point about the tedium and pointlessness of life because there's just a circular bad repetition of time ad nauseum, ad infinitum of the same, with the consequence that there's nothing new under the sun, that life inherently becomes meaningless in the face of eternal recurrence. So Ecclesiastes says, all things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what will be done is what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes' answer for this tragedy is to find satiety in God and what he provides. But Nietzsche proposed a solution for a godless world. For Nietzsche, the higher types are distinguished from the lower types in terms of two different kinds of love or desire, because the higher types do not need to find value in the world, such as with Ecclesiastes' God, eros, like the lower types, but rather transfiguringly bestow a healthy meaning onto the world with a secular agape. For Nietzsche, agape allows for a glass half full amor fati, or love of fate, and dancing in your chains. In Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, Jesus redefines love, saying, "You have heard it said that you shall love, agapeses, your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love, agapate, your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Nietzsche said, quote, "I've never desecrated the holy name of love," unquote. We find further historical analogies to Nietzsche's eternal return with the Stoics and Schopenhauer. The Stoic Seneca wrote, quote, "Some people suffer from a surfeit of doing and seeing the same things. Theirs is not contempt for life, but boredom with it, a feeling we sink into when influenced by the sort of philosophy which makes us say, how long the same old things? I shall wake up and go to sleep. I shall eat and be hungry. I shall be cold and hot. There is no end to anything, but all the things are just in a fixed cycle, fleeing and pursuing one another. Night follows day, summer passes into autumn, hard on to autumn follows winter, and in that turn is checked by spring. All things pass only to return. Nothing I do or see is new. Sometimes one even gets sick at this. There are many who think life is not hard but superfluous." Okay, I'll finish up here. Similarly, we find another historical analogy by Schopenhauer in his studies on pessimism. Schopenhauer says, "He who lives to see 2 or 3 generations is like a man who sits sometimes in the conjurer's booth at a fair and witnesses the performance twice or thrice in succession. The tricks were meant to be seen only once, and when they are no longer a novelty and cease to deceive, their effect is gone." So all these analogies to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence that the dwarf experiences in Nietzsche's Zarathustra reflect the ancient problems of the horror loci, revulsion at one's place and state of being. It is only when we fully encounter the force of eternal return that do we come to see the darkness of Nietzsche's vision, a meaningless Ecclesiastes world, but without God to fall back on for meaning, purpose, and joy. However, temporal eternal recurrence isn't inherently tragic because when it wipes values away from beings, the positive vanishes, but also the negative, and leaves things neither inherently positive nor negative, and because of this, completely open to interpretation. Nihilism is a problem when we have an erotic approach to beings like the glory-seeking Achilles. I love her because she is beautiful. Rather than approach akin to a godless kind of Christian transfiguring agape. I have the spirit of loving that makes worthy widow, orphan, stranger, and enemy. That higher type is what Nietzsche calls, quote, Caesar with the soul of Christ, the overman, unquote. It is a Christ-like Caesar, conquering not with might, but rather with love, a transfiguring, bestowing glass half full approach to life. Okay, so I've got almost out of time. Do I have time to finish my last paragraph?
You spoke for 20 minutes, so could you perhaps you can keep going, but shouldn't take more than two minutes.
So basically, yeah, okay, so I'll finish it up. So basically how you can think of this is Nietzsche wrote a letter to his friend Overbeck when he was at a rainy cottage with friends, and he talked about the cabin fever that was affecting everyone. And he said, but he wasn't experiencing that because he was busy creating his third untimely meditation, and so he was enraptured in that. So the feeling of eternal recurrence of this terrible cabin fever or a child's timeout, it's not an objective feature of reality, but it's rather a way the mind auto affects itself in order to create the experience of time. So you can have one person experiencing something joyously and the other person being devastated by cabin fever, even though they're right beside one another. It's not a reality in the world. It's just the way we experience. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this powerful talk. I think we're going to move on to Julie's presentation, and then we'll have the questions. So first things, so Julie Momméja, I heard something through the grapevine, which is that Julie just handed her PhD in, so we can give Julie a clap. Julie's a PhD candidate in American and Media Studies at the Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris, and a scholar in residence at the Long Now Foundation in San Francisco. She was also a visiting researcher at UC Berkeley from 2014 to 2017. Julie's research focuses on pioneers and thinkers within the San Francisco Bay Area counterculture and cyberculture spheres, and the emergence of technology as a social tool on a territory rooted in utopian and libertarian ideologies. Her PhD dissertation explores bonds, connections, and fusions between offline and virtual communities from the 1960s until the 2010s, within a context of long-term co-evolution between humans and machines favored by the specificity of the local Bay Area mindset. So Julie, whenever you want, don't know if you have a PowerPoint or
I do.
that you want to share.
Yes.
Okay. Your microphone seems to be a bit low. Could you speak so that?
Yes, I will. Is it better now?
It is. We can hear you, but I find it a little bit low still.
Closer to my computer, maybe.
Yeah, it's not very loud.
Yeah, I'm on my computer microphone, so can you hear me better now?
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
You can go ahead.
I'll try to speak louder.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for the presentation, and thank you all for having me, and thanks for the congratulations on the dissertation. Thank you, John, and thank you, Michelle, for introducing the clock of the Long Now that I'm gonna speak about right now. Before I begin, I wanted to say that this paper was written following participant observation at the Long Now Foundation in San Francisco. However, though I'm a scholar in residence there, I want to highlight the fact that the views here expressed are my own. I'm going to move to my keynote. And please let me know if it works.
We don't see it yet. Perfect, yes. Yes, and indeed, when you turn up the volume of your computer, I mean, if you do so, you will be able to hear Julie much better. Okay, so whenever you want, Julie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can see your PowerPoint, so we're good.
In a world of short-termism and rapid news cycles favored by ever-changing technologies, fostering long-term thinking and responsibility towards future generations, not only through decades or centuries, but millennia, may seem quite a challenge. Yet, in the late 1980s, and as the new millennium was approaching, American engineer and computer scientist Danny Hillis, who Michelle mentioned, felt that the general idea of the future was shrinking. He needed an excuse to think beyond the year 2000 on a much longer term, and designing a giant clock was his answer, one that would tick for 10,000 years, once a year, with a century hand advancing every 100 years, and the cuckoo coming out each millennium. This paper reflects on the clock and the nonprofit organization protecting it from San Francisco, the Long Now Foundation. It suggests ways in which collective long-term thinking can be encouraged beyond anthropocentrism, By reframing human endeavor on the new longer narrative and time span, with the announced mission of being good ancestors to the generations to come, how does the Long Now Foundation, with its clock project, fulfill its ambition of reconfiguring mindsets about time? How does it tackle negative opinions, stating issues situated in the here and now are more crucial to resolve than the construction of a techno-utopian monument? This paper purports to shed some light on American ways of deconstructing anthropocentrism by literally placing humanity as a footnote in time. To answer these questions, 3 main points will be developed here. First, I will talk about the year 2000 from utopia to reality, and I will mostly talk about the clock founding ideas by Danny Hillis and Brian Eno. And then the second point will be about the foundation, the Long Now Foundation, and how it tries to foster long-term thinking. And the third point will focus on the clock of the Long Now as the machine in the mountain. As the second half of the 1990s began, engineer Danny Hillis felt that time was slipping away. As the new millennium approached, the general perception of the future was shrinking. In an article published in Wired magazine, which followed an email he had sent to his friends, Hillis detailed his feeling of diminished temporal projection as he approached the long-awaited year 2000. So I quote here, when I was a kid 3 decades ago, the future was a long way off. So was the turn of the millennium. Dates like 1984 and 2001 were comfortably remote. But the funny thing is that in all these years, the future that people think about has not moved past the millennium. It's as if the future has been shrinking 1 year per year for my entire life. 2005 is still too far away to plan for, and 2030 is too far away to even think about. Why bother making plans when everything will change? So in 1995, the year 2000 still appeared as a very distant and invisible time marker to Danny Hillis. That future had often been imagined through dystopian works of science fiction, but Hillis's vision was definitely part of a more hopeful future. With the year 1984 already passed, and the year 2000, that of the space odyssey proposed by Stanley Kubrick in '68, which still seemed far too distant to him, Danny Hillis imagined a future in which he could project himself. A new millennium made up of projects taking into account future generation. In that article he published in Wired in '95, he gave the example of the renovation of the ceiling of College Hall in New College, Oxford. During the construction of the ladder in the 14th century, the craftsmen of the time had thought about the future of their creation and had planted the oak forest necessary to replace the first beams they had laid. Hillis's vision is thus based on optimism, a faith in the future, but above all, the need to think over a much longer period of time than daily life would normally allow. Long-term thinking compensates for the gaps by keeping information, making it accessible, and planning for the future, however distant it may be. The seeds of the promise of a better future, better because anticipated, are sown with the idea of the construction of a clock that will cross the ages, not just decades or centuries, but millennia, to run for 10,000 years. A clock that would be fueled by solar and thermic powers, and also occasional human rewinding from its visitors. Danny Hillis dreamt of a timeless creation, which would survive him and our civilization, and which, beyond giving time in hours and millennia, would itself become an object of science fiction, a myth. Hillis thus imagined a complete overhaul of the clock as a practical tool. In that 95 article in Wired, he said, "I want to build a clock that ticks once a year. The century hand advances once every 100 years, and the cuckoo comes out on the millennium. I want the cuckoo to come out every millennium for the next 10,000 years. If I hurry, I should finish the clock in time to see the cuckoo come out for the first time." So through this description, the clock goes beyond its use as an everyday object to become a testament to our civilization, the link between the year 2000, which is approaching, but which nevertheless seems distant, and the year 12,000, which is unattainable, but which the creator is nevertheless thinking about. In the same way that the 14th century Oxford carpenters thought of their 18th century fellow descendants, Hillis's project aims to bequeath a tool monument to future generations. I quote, "When I tell my friends about the millennium clock, either they get it or they don't," unquote. The Hillis clock is firmly focused on the future, and it also appears as a test. The clock test allows to know the projection capacities over the very long term of people confronted with the very idea of the project. The simple fact of considering the possibility of a clock calls for a wide range of personalities from different universes. Indeed, Hillis informs his friends about the project. Among them is Stuart Brand, who won the National Book Award in 1971 for his Whole Earth catalog. That catalog started in 1968, and it offered an incredible list of tools to its readers, most of whom were based in remote countercultural communes in the American West and needed access to tools, whether it was hammers or books or clove. They wanted to be autonomous in the American wilderness. Brand, after hearing about the idea of this new type of tool for the future, that is the clock, started thinking of an organization capable of making the clock last through the years. One of the other friends Hillis told about the project was British musician Brian Eno. Eno, master of ambient music, was the one who gave its name to the clock, a name that it still retains to this day, the clock of the long now. Based in New York in the late 1970s, while taking a break from his career as a musician, Eno went to a party hosted by a local celebrity, where he became aware of the different conceptions two people could have of the here and the now while talking with the host of the party. He said, "I realized that the here she lived in stopped at her front door. This was a very strange thought to me. My here includes the neighborhood, at least. After that, I noticed that young, arty New Yorkers were just as local in their sense of now. Now meant this week. No one had any investment in any kind of future except their own, conceived in the narrowest terms. I wrote in my notebook that December, more and more, I found I want to be living in a big here and a long now." So that long now, as opposed to the short now, became the name of the clock, and later that of the organization Stuart Brand envisioned, the Long Now Foundation. Which makes me start my second point on the foundation and how it fosters long-term thinking. The foundation thus started in 1996 and was created by the three men here quoted and a group of friends, including, among others, internet specialist Esther Dyson and engineer Alexander Rose, who is now the executive director of the foundation. The project obtained a nonprofit organization status that confers it an educational aim, allowing tax exemptions for donations made by members and patrons. It also institutionalizes the organization, gives it an aura of public utility, strengthening its vocation to develop long-term thinking within society at large. To do so, one of the tactics used by the founders of the Long Now Foundation is to add a zero in front of the numbering of the years. As the millennium approaches and in view of the year 10,000, 1999 thus became 1999, a practice that is still used today by the Foundation. Starting in 2006, a membership program was started, a subscription system for members who, through different rates and membership levels, have free access to monthly seminars held by the Foundation in San Francisco and their video recordings available online. From $8 per month to $10,000 for 10,000 years of subscription, the membership programs contributes both to the creation of a network of members worldwide and to the partial financing of the organization and its various projects. Such a network also helps fostering long-term thinking within society. This horizon of nearly 10,000 years onwards, around the year to 12,000, the lifetime of the clock of the long now, is justified as an appropriate time frame due to the end of the Ice Age approximately 10,000 years ago, which then led to the beginning of agriculture and human civilization. The perspective of the same duration must therefore be developed in the opposite direction towards the future. Such a revival of frameworks of thought places human beings and our civilization at the center of the long now, equidistant from the Ice Age and the unknown era, which will see the end of the functioning of the long now clock in the future. Such a timeline thus makes it possible to place the short now of everyday life in perspective with the long now of past human civilization, that which saw and gave birth to the first cities, the pyramids of Giza or Stonehenge. It transformed this short now we are living in into a footnote in time. But above all, the long now timeline shows the recent civilization of the industrial era and the current one in the years 2000 of the digital era at the center of this long now, whose future civilizations remain unknown. The Foundation thus seeks to link present-day humanity to this distant future civilizations. The clock then becomes a common thread, a utilitarian object that indicates the years, centuries, and millennia to the visitor, but it is also and above all beyond the myth that surrounds it and aims to preserve it. It creates a link between generations and an altered relay that crosses the ages. As hoped by Danny Hillis, the first prototype of the clock got completed in time at the end of 1999 and signaled the passage into a new millennium. The year 2000, an event that seemed so distant to Hillis in the mid-1990s, finally went beyond science fiction and myth to become reality. The clock prototype, just as the one currently being built, is mechanical and made of highly resistant materials. It combines astronomical and clock-making knowledges and appears as a celestial, spatial, and temporal compass. It also allows to know the positioning of the horizon, the sun, the moon, and the stars, thanks to the observation of the clock face, as you can see on this image. The first prototype of the clock, which ran on January 1st, 2000, has been on exhibition at the Science Museum in London since June of that same year. It imposes by the complexity of its mechanical elements and that of the details of its interface. This prototype is nevertheless the reduced model of a much larger clock, which will be 200 feet or 61 meters high. And that clock, the final one, will be in a mountain that will protect it. Because to protect itself, the clock of the long now must hide itself in the depth to survive in what Stuart Brown calls, I quote, deep future. Initially, the mountain chosen to shelter the clock was Mount Washington, a summit culminating at 3,500 meters of altitude, located in the National Park of the Great Basin in Nevada. This site is home to some of the oldest specimens of trees in the world, the bristlecone pines, whose Latin name, Pinus longeva, translates to longevity over time. Their estimated age is around 5,000 years for the oldest pine trees ever analyzed in this area of western Nevada. These organisms with dense wood, hard as stone, thrive in arid conditions, a windy and cold weather. This very harsh environment seems to be the secret of their millennial longevity. And it brings us back in time to the construction of Stonehenge or the pyramids of Giza, or even further back, as rings and some dead bristlecone trunks go back 10,000 years in time. In the opposite direction of the long now chronology, this bristlecone pine projects us into a future in which the clock continues to slowly turn in what Fernand Braudel calls semi-immobility. In 2005, the idea of building the clock on a new site was born, far from Mount Washington, in the western desert of Texas. The main reason for such a turnaround were financial ones and difficulties associated with the diversity of property types around the foundation's land on Mount Washington. Because of his friendship with Jeff Bezos, Danny Hillis decided to move his monumental clock to a new mountain belonging to the founder of Amazon. The decision has accelerated the construction of the monument, while Bezos has injected $42 million into the project. The intervention of a new wealthy actor highlights the limits of the financing of the project, with the only participation of the members of the foundation. The projection towards the long now thus necessarily involves a return to the realities of the here and now. Collaboration with new players seems necessary for the relay to be passed on over time and to be able to materialize. Such an association does not happen without negative feedback. They remain rare, but reveal the tensions between the social urgency of devoting oneself to the now and devoting financial funds to it, and the need for long now thought to better be able to put these current issues into perspective. Two recent articles published in 2020 share their rather harsh criticisms of the project, not particularly for the substance, but for the sake of form, namely the sum committed to build it through the person of Jeff Bezos. One of the journalists denounces a certain closure of the project to the attention of the general public, and elitism aimed at denouncing the disconnection of in the face of the everyday problems of individuals that the clock is supposed to inspire on the long term. In the meantime, the foundation insists that it intends for the clock to be accessible to the public at some point in the future. The help provided by the founder of Amazon seems to be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the tremendous momentum of the possibilities made available by his donation of several tens of millions of dollars. And on the other hand, the challenge of being now associated with a giant of big tech, or GAFAM, located in the here and now of profit. To conclude, I would say that the fact remains that the foundation pursues its mission of long-term thinking. With a clock project whose completion should take place in the next few years, and also other projects related to archiving languages and reviving extinct species of animals, the Long Now Foundation plays on the frontier of time, long and present. It highlights the human need to project ourselves toward the future and the necessity to be good ancestors to the generations to come. It proves that now truly is a footnote in the long timeline of humanity, and that even the clock at some point in the long distant future will turn itself into a footnote as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was fantastic. I and really echoed what we were saying with Michelle earlier on about the power dynamics behind time, and the fact that Amazon and Google are creating their own timescales, obviously. Do we have questions from the floor? Don't be shy. Yes, Michelle.
Sorry. I had well, for John and for Julie, I wanted to ask. Sorry to just jump in straight away, but they, they were both really fascinating papers, and I guess John, I mean, I hope this isn't missing the point of your paper too much, but I was really interested when you were talking about the, some of the examples that you were using to talk about this experience of the different ways that times can flow, and you were talking about Christmas and days of the week, which are both social constructions of time, and that I mean, it's just kind of pinpointed something that I think is really interesting in continental approaches to time and the way they keep pushing out points about social time, because things only flow through the days of the week when everything's going normally. So, there's loads of stuff now with COVID where people are saying that the days, there's no such thing as Tuesday anymore. And, and you can experience this just generally on holidays, but with COVID, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday thing doesn't exist anymore. And it's not necessarily an individual perception of time, it's because the cultural structure around that understanding of time isn't working in the way that it used to. And the same with Christmas, I suppose. So I was just wondering about, I think it's interesting how there's a leaning on these social concepts of time, but without, because the focus is on the individual perception of time, we don't get to look at those experiences of time are given to us, by the society that we're in and given to us in different kinds of ways.
One thing I found really interesting in my reading this, I take it from like the point of view of interpreting Heidegger, because that's where I come from. But it's interesting if you look back into the Greeks, and I'll just use the example of the longovile, the boredom, the stretching out of time that we experience. The Greeks actually didn't have a word for boredom. They did, but it doesn't map onto what we have. Like for them, it was all completely social. So it was Aristophanes gives the example of one of his characters was waiting for the political event to begin, and he's like, I walk back and forth, I scratch myself, I burp, and like he goes around saying all these symptoms of boredom, but not something that he was experiencing inside himself. Like for them, it was a completely external phenomena. And as we move down through the Stoics, through Plato and so forth, you get a push inside of this business of the stretching out of time and boredom as they became more and more introspective. But originally, that particular experience of time was fundamentally not experienced the way we experience it, and they didn't even have a term for what would be like an internal, like the Stoics called it the horror loci, or sorry, the horror loci. So yeah, the experience, what we experience as time changes culturally, it changes personally. It's a very, very plastic concept.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Can I ask Julie a question too, Sarah? So Julie, I mean, I was wondering it was really interesting to hear you talk, because I was wondering where the points of critical distance you have with the Clock of the Long Now Foundation, because a lot of what you were saying is sort of close to what they say themselves about what their project was. And I wanted to know where you pull apart from their story about what the clock is, I guess. I mean, perhaps I should say I'm one of these people that is quite worried that Jeff Bezos is paying for this clock. I'm writing about it in this chapter, but it's been in a blog post previously that I think in aligning with him, they're really undermining their interest in long-term thinking, given this kind of clock of Amazon. So the way that our interaction with Amazon encourages us to short-term thinking, the one-click buy it now, get things delivered. He's creating this infrastructure of a sense of time and interacting with time that actually encourages very short-term thinking, at the same time claiming that he's interested in long-term thinking and paying for this clock of the long now. And I think that's a clash that it'd be interesting to hear them respond to, but they don't. Like the director, I think, can't remember his name now, responded to one of my tweets about this. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear what points of critical distance you might have from their story about what this clock is doing. I mean, do you think it really is doing all this stuff, or are there points where it's falling apart, where they might want to think a bit more critically about how time's operating in a broader sense, I suppose, other than this magnificent thing that they're building?
Well, I think, and that's what I was trying to insist on at the beginning, that I'm totally independent regarding what I'm saying and all of that. So that's what I was trying to show here in that paper, that those tensions exist and have been highlighted in recent articles mostly. And of course, and that's what I was trying to say, like this discrepancy between like having such an enormous amount of money that is wonderful, because the clock, it's what made the clock become possible and what made it being built right now. And the negative point being that Amazon is more and more criticized for the way they are treating their employees and all of that. So, and
yeah, which links with Brian Eno's big here, that whole idea of the big here. We're supposed to be interested in those things, but yeah.
But so, I cannot talk in the name, of course, but they're still focused on the original clock ideals, the ones that Hillis and Eno talked about, and they don't really mention anything about the origin of the foundings, because they're trying to really focus on the fact that this is just amazing that it can do that without money.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem the focus is on the technology of getting this thing to work for 10,000 years rather than really about fostering long-term senses of time in some ways. I should also say the doomsday clock is currently being updated. In the next 6 minutes, the time on the doomsday clock will be changed. So I thought I should say that too. Hey?
We will know more in 6 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, so just to bring up. Thank you, Julie. It was really enjoyed your paper.
Do we have other questions? Yes. So I can't see your name, but there's one person raising her hand. So Laura, yes.
Right, me, yeah. Laura, PhD fellow at the University of Oslo. I sort of have known about the clock of the long time, the clock of the long now for a while now. I'm really interested in deep time as well. And I think if I could just maybe sort of comment on it, I think what they do as a platform, right? So their lecture series, which is also a podcast series, is something that I listen to. I listen to very many of those, and I think that's definitely good work. I think that the clock, right? The actual structure of the clock. I think that the sort of concept, the science fictionality of the idea is maybe more powerful than actually trying to put this clock in a mountain, right? And I think, there are more of these sort of long-term infrastructures, right? Like there's the seed vault up in Svalbard. There's like, there's this sort of concept floating around the internet of this sort of data tower, which features innovative ways of storing digital data into the very long future. I think those ideas, I feel like they've already done their work, and you don't need to sort of manifest them concretely, unless perhaps manifesting them concretely, right, building them sort of uncovers other interesting problems with regard to sort of deep time. But I think just having sort of thought of the thing, or sort of like put it out there. I mean, this is sort of Stuart Brand. He's like a sort of idea man, right? I don't look to him to sort of I don't know, maybe I'm sort of skeptical, but But yeah, I value sort of the idea, but I don't think that that it's worth a lot of money to put into this idea. Not when that money is better spent in different places, right? In the actual now, not the long now.
Right, and that's where the the justification for fostering long-term thinking comes from. It's like by making those things like real, you will force people to think long-term, and I mean not force, but incite them to think long-term. And by doing so, you will transform the now because people will consider the now differently when they think on a longer term. And yes, and the clock was definitely supposed to be a myth for years until that money really materialized and made the whole thing really possible, like beyond the prototype and all of that. So yeah, the idea really, I mean, and the myth really became reality in the last few years. And of course, yeah, you mentioned the seminars as well, and that's also their way to really be present in the here and now, because with the clock being built, people don't have access to it yet, and we don't know how long it's gonna really take. But the seminars and the interval, which is the long now bar and cafe where talks also organized in normal times, really materializes that ambition they have to change things right now and not in 10,000 years from now.
Can I add something?
Yes.
I would say thank you, Julie. Actually, I actually met Julie at the Long Now. It's the director of the Long Now that introduced us at this little cafe. That's wonderful, where we were listening to a talk. And I'm a bit like you. Like the clock leaves me cold. As in, I'm just like, what a tremendous waste of money. But I think what they're doing in terms of their platform and the talks they have and the kind of public they reach is extraordinary, because they invite actually scholars like philosophers and 19th century scholars, who talk about different kinds of things. And they reach, what's really interesting to me in that ecosystem is that they reach people who normally we wouldn't reach as scholars of the 19th century, or as philosophers and as academics. And so when you go to Long Now, it's full of techies, who are not necessarily always interested in those questions, but they have managed to sort of interest that public in those questions. So I think that work that they're doing is interesting, and I wish we had at the university we had the kind of platform that they have, but they're doing the work of making our work so that more accessible. So I think that's a good thing that they do. But I do agree with you, Michelle, in terms of like the funding and the clock. That's I find that a little bit more baffling. But I do love their platform.
The big here was prompted by, as you said, John, was people on their front step to get into their loft apartments, and I just wonder where that, as other people were brought, how does that big here and the Long Now, how do they go together? How do the homeless people that are sort of discarded in this world that Brian, wants to bring attention to, what are the parallels with them and the Amazon fulfillment workers? I guess it's partly our definition of what a clock is that we think that, like, do we think we can talk about the device as a thing on itself because of the way we've defined clocks, when actually the clock includes all those Amazon fulfillment centers, because that's what kind of is making it possible. That's part of the infrastructure that's enabling this clock to work. Does that matter or not? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's hard to really have a right answer here, but considering the big here and we were also mentioning archives, they're also working on preserving languages. I don't know if you heard about the Rosetta project, which is one of the main Long Now projects, where basically they're archiving all of the human languages on a small disk, and one of them is already up in space. So that kind of completes the big here part of the equation by trying to to save information, to save codes like human codes in the big here and in the long now, with the hope that someone will find them in thousands of years from now. So there's always this utopian side mixed with what is the reality of the now, and how do you tackle both at the same time? And yeah, that's a tricky question.
Yes, we have one question. I can't see your name, but go ahead. We can't see you yet.
Hi, is it you said? Hi, thank you. Yeah, just on that archiving of languages and sending a disk out to space for the future. Just thinking about this idea of decentralizing humans from the idea of respect for the planet, or thinking about the long now and the kind of the optimism that can come with planting a forest. How do you equate what we do now to look after what we have with sending a disk out to space that may or may not be accessible in the future as a record of human presence? Or how do you see that? How do you understand that in the project?
I see that as, you know, a mix of dystopian and utopian realities, like always like being mixed together. Because yeah, why would we want to, you know, save languages up in space if we thought that the planet was going to survive us? And what about the clock? Well, the clock is supposed, because the clock is made to survive like some sort of apocalypse, or to survive like some nuclear war or possible attack. So there's always this tension in between utopia and dystopia. And I think that's also very specific to the Bay Area and science fiction from the 80s and cyberpunk science fiction. Because that's really the place where all those like different themes come out from. So yes, it's like yeah, the need to protect and to archive, and all this put in tension with what happens if we don't have civilization in 10,000 years from now.
Thank you again. David, you had a question. Perhaps one last, if you have a question afterwards. But David, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, actually, the first thing I was going to say was sort of covered by Laura, which is to say that, you know, the Clock of the Long Now is an art project. It works surely best as something unrealized, or only sort of provisionally realized. You know, in the Science Museum clock, you know, it's like Arthur Ganson's Machine with Concrete, or Katie Patterson's work. You know, these provocations to make us think about time, and I'm wondering about this urge to realize it, and what lies behind that, and what that leads to. It's comparable in some ways with with Finland's Onkalo project to create a nuclear waste repository for 10,000 years. And you know, if anyone's familiar with Vincent Iolenti's work on that project in his book Deep Time Reckoning, there's some very interesting material in there about how it is essentially an engine. It's viewed by the engineers involved in constructing this deep earth repository as purely a kind of technical challenge, and virtually no consideration is given to its imaginative potential, its kind of mythic resonances. So I'm interested in the translation from something that's meant to be an imaginative provocation into a technical challenge, what this says to us, and also what the clock can or can't say about how we practice time. It seems to me curiously silent about how time is practiced, particularly once it's, you know, in this idea that it should be a kind of realized thing. You know, it should actually exist. What does that tell us about how we do practice time, or how we should practice time?
And what's interesting about that is that the initial project included a library that was supposed to come with a clock, and that project is now separated. It's called the Manual for Civilization, and it's supposed to be online at some point. But it goes back to how to rebuild a civilization from scratch. So you always have, again, that dystopian possibility for the future. But it's true that the clock in itself doesn't really have any like human, like palpable thing. It's like a cold object in the mountain. So what is it gonna be seen like in 7 years from now? If it survives the long now, it's hard to tell or to know, but it's definitely a technological challenge. And yeah, with I guess the best engineers working on it to make it reality. So transferring the myth into a reality.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Perhaps we have time for one last question, and I think afterwards we'll have to stop. Do we have one last question? There's so many. There are so many things to say. Questions keep popping in my head, but Laura, perhaps you had something else to say, and then.
Yeah, well, just on David's point about, so what kind of practices would congeal around this clock? Julie mentioned the library. I think part of the library is also, I vaguely remember this from Stuart Brand's book on the topic, is that it would also feature a kind of diachronic postal service where you can write a letter to your descendants, and then they'll get it in the mail and it'll go, I'm so sorry, we fucked up. I don't know, something like that probably, but that's sort of one of the practices that I remember from that book. And I think it features more. It's a very thin book, and it's more ideas than it is sort of real good essays, but it might be interesting.
Right, because it's already like 21 years old now. But just to go back to that library, I also talk about that in my dissertation, but what the Internet Archive does in terms of saving information for the future and archiving human knowledge is quite amazing. But they chose a different angle because the Long Now wants it to be, I mean, with a clock, it has to be all mechanical without any electronic piece that would stop working in the long term. Whereas the Internet Archive, which is also a non-profit organization, like they update their hard drives all the time to keep all that information on digital devices. So it's also a project for the long now or for the long term, but tackled in a different way.
Okay, thank you so much, John, Julie, and Michelle. That was fascinating. And we meet again tomorrow at 2, I believe. Am I No, not at 2. Tomorrow is, sorry, Friday at 2. Tomorrow, Friday, sorry, Estelle, do you have the schedule? Friday at?
Tomorrow is from 5 to 7 French time. And we'll be speaking about, what we'll listen, sorry, what we'll be speaking about. I'm just as tired as everyone else.
Imagined futures. Imagined
futures. Thank you, Diane. And actually, we'll listen to Diane and David Farrer and Vincent Jonas talk about these different imagined futures. So please join us if you can.
Thank you so much, everyone, and attendees. Okay.
Thank you.
Now.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.